I want to set the kind of vision that is likely to be out there in 2030. And that's not so easy to do, but Boris said, the Remain-in guys have no vision, so I thought it's time to give a little bit of vision of what the world's likely to look like, because that's the kind of decision which we're taking in the next month or so, on the 23rd of June, for our future rather than our past. So I refer to a document here, which is the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System. I'm honorary president, having set this system up within the European institutions, which is aiming to give foresight into the way in which the European decision-making is taken. And this book is on global trends to 2030. Can the EU meet the challenges ahead? And simply put, it is a document which looks at 5 major trends which are underway in the global system. You can tap it down on your net or whatever, but this concentrates them into 5 major trends. And the first one is a richer and older human race characterized by an expanding global middle class and greater inequalities. Second, a more vulnerable process of globalization led by the economic G3, the US, China, and the EU. A transformative industrial and technological revolution, to which Dan referred. Fourthly, a growing nexus of climate change, energy, and competition for resources. And fifthly, a changing power, interdependence, and fragile multilateralism. There's one particular document which I'd like to draw your attention to. I have copies here if anybody wants to see it, but I can't really show it to you other than explain it to you. This is the shift of the economic center of the globe from day one of the Christian era to 2025. And here you have that in the day one, the center was somewhere in the Middle East between the Roman Empire and China. From 1800 onwards, it shifted northwest and arrived in the North Atlantic around 1950. Since then, with the rise of Asia, and in particular China, the center of gravity is predicted to be at the Chinese frontier at 2025. The report continues that these trends may well give a greater or less extent 3 global structural revolutions which are actually going on in terms of everybody having to adjust to it, not just ourselves, but the rest of the European Union and the major powers around the globe. They are the global economic technological revolution, the global social and democratic revolution, and the global geopolitical revolution, where you can see in this document predictions that around the European Union, you might think it's fragile today, but failed states, fragile states are going to be worse in 10 years' time than they are today. So it's in conclusions I just wanted to cite to you. Powerful forces of globalization will continue to transform the world. Poor adaptation, fragmenting multilateralism are making it more difficult to force collective approaches to resolving problems in a peaceful fashion, despite manifestly increasing interdependence, which is helped by greater connectivity. The world is therefore becoming more complex and more insecure. The steady decline of Western power, and that I think refutes something that Dan was saying, it's Western power, not just ourselves, not just the European Union, with the rise of the competing Asian economies, China foremost. So you see increasing political tensions and conflicts in the Middle East and possibly in Asia. A possible major realignment around Russia, China, and the Middle East. Together, these factors could generate an atmosphere of insecurity and conflict reminiscent of pivotal moments in the early 20th century. That, I think, is maybe you think a little bit alarmist, but that's the way in which the outside globe is shaping itself. It's a world moving from a 2-country balance of the 1980s, where we were secure with the unsatisfactory position of a communist regime. Now we're moving into a world where multilateralism is much less easy to maintain in a multipolar system. So with that background, there are 4 points which come up for me about what Brexiteers are telling me, which I don't quite match up with the information which I find in this document, which you can download, by the way, on the Orbis website. First, they say that the EU is falling in terms of its percentage share of global GDP. Yes, it is indeed. But so are all the Western powers, including the UK, as the economic shift towards Asia or away from the West, including the US, continues apace. Secondly, they say that in regional blocks, as Dan has tonight, is a feature of the 1950s and 1960s. But on the contrary, countries are forming blocks today across the globe in order to better leverage their capacity to influence global rules. A clear illustration of this was in Nairobi the end of last year at the conclusions of the World Trade Organization Ministerial. Third, they say that, and this is Michael Gove maybe more than Dan, that the EU is an analog structure in a digital world. As a founder of the European Internet Forum, I find it very bizarre that this kind of claim is made, because the whole focus of the institutions today is to create a digital single market to sweep away the barriers and problems of being able to be better connected, understanding that the speed of technology is changing much faster than we can go. And of course, if you're living in the south of England, let's not rely wholly on BT to solve all our problems. Fourth, they never cease to say, Brexiteers, that the EU is undemocratic. This is, I find, a very strange kind of thought, because they say it is an unelected commission. Well, they fail to point out that, like the United States, in Europe you have a separation between the executive on the one side and the legislature on the other. Very similar kind of structure, even if the powers are somewhat different. So the EU is very much like the US. The US cabinet is unelected. Their advisors appointed by the President of the United States. They have their democratic legitimacy because they have hearings in the Senate. Guess what? Commissioners aren't a label like the US cabinet. They can't stand for Congress. The commissioners can't stand for the European Parliament. They're not elected, but they get their democratic legitimacy from being hearings in the European Parliament. So it's a very similar kind of system. And I do ask those who are saying it's undemocratic, but the US is a great democratic system, there's an inconsistency in that argument. So listening to the debates and the arguments in the debate so far, it seems as if there's little knowledge about what the EU system is and very little willingness to explain it to people that there is actually a European democratic system functioning effectively. Having been there for 30 years, I know a little bit about that, but it seems to me that here that there really is understanding also the global system emerging, wanting to have some kind of linkage with the markets which speak our language. But China is a huge market. It doesn't actually speak English. We have to actually understand that our whole approach in a world where you're seeing big entities monitoring and judging on what the multilateral system will be, we will be better off with those who have some clout. So what is the best course to chart as we now move in to the last weeks of the debate of whether we vote in favour or against? A Winston Churchill quote, I guess, is normally in order, but this is a nice one. Want of foresight, unwillingness to act when action would be simple and effective, lack of clear thinking, confusion of counsel until the emergency comes, until self-preservation strikes its jarring gong. These are the features which constitute the endless repetition of history. What we have in this particular kind of process that I described to you of Espace is a foresight system perched at the top of the European institutions. It's not meant to predict the future. Nobody can predict the future. But the point is that the changes of the trends which we see underway, where you see a whole mobilization of the Chinese with their companies going to 4G and 5G, being much quicker than ourselves, we know we need to up our game. But here there are three elements which I'll end on, which I think are really important for the future of our country as being, if you're looking towards 2030, 2040. The world, to repeat, is becoming more complex and more insecure. It's a world in mutation. We are increasingly interdependent, with Europe in transition as well. If the West does not lead, then others, such as China, less inclined to support multilateral rules, will step into the vacuum. It's fashionable, particularly amongst Brexiteers, to deride every effort that the EU is making to adapt and formulate European decisions. And yet, I believe, by sharing sovereignty in certain areas, not in all areas within the European Union, it's enabling Europe to cope with retaining stability on the European continent in very tough circumstances. Despite, for example, living through the greatest recession that we have had since the Second World War, and remember, our base rate in the UK hasn't changed since March 2009 from 0.5%. We've never been at 0.5% since 1692, since the beginning of the Bank of England. It shows you that something isn't normal in our way of life. We've had quantitative easing to try and pump things. We've actually increased our debt by 600 billion, which Dan and I would agree seems to be rather bizarre. But listen, this is not a normal economic circumstance, but the single market has remained open for business during this period. Secondly, under this question of sharing sovereignty, we may think that the EU is making a mess of the migratory problems that we've got, which is the biggest influx of people that we have seen since the Second World War, from countries which are becoming fragile, failed states, Iraq and Syria. What has happened? Well, you heard on the news today that the trickle has now come to, let's say, under 1,000 people a month coming through into the European Union from Turkey, because there's been a deal which has been struck of Europe acting collectively together. So my stance would be, from a sharing sovereignty point of view, it may have its problems, it may have its difficulties, but if we can, one by one, be able to have a collective action, to be able to have an effective decision which helps us in our country to live peaceably, then I, for one, am for that. Secondly, is shaping the international system. As I've said to you, it's an international system which is now changing very rapidly with a shift from west to east, and the power of China becomes more and more prominent in the global system. So it's not surprising that we have Mr. Obama, because after all, President of the United States, head of NATO, by the way, and he said in his interview in the Daily Telegraph that we should be proud that the EU has helped spread British values and practices, democracy, rule of law, open markets, across the continent and to its periphery. The European Union doesn't moderate British influence, it magnifies it. A strong Europe is not a threat to Britain's global leadership, it enhances Britain's global leadership. And this is from the guy who's elected President of the United States. It would have been the same message, by the way, if it had come from George W. Bush Sr. or Jr. It's been a consistent theme under US foreign policy. So as the campaign has developed, it's actually become crystal clear. There are very few people in the United States who would think that Britain should leave the European Union, other than the Republican candidate to be Donald Trump. And also, of course, Mr. Putin as well, if you wish to think about any other global leader who thinks this is a good idea. But on the contrary, I would argue that what is actually being now taken place is this transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which had a lot of flack in the social media and from some of saying this is maybe difficult to negotiate. It will be, in my view, completed or finalized by the end of the year, because it's not just the question of economic rules and regulatory cooperation we're discussing, but it's actually how you have transatlantic leadership in the global system to keep the multilateral system operating. So in the areas of digital, financial, political, these are things which would be, I think, on the agenda over the next 5 years. So for me, as I'm not unashamed to say, as a convinced European and transatlanticist, it would be a real shock that Britain decides to leave the European Union at the very time that the European Union signs a big trade agreement with the United States, which we would then be no longer part of. So lastly, it's the question which came up today by the Prime Minister. If you're thinking about shaping the international system, we also don't want to take unnecessary decisions which are going to lead to real risks for our jobs and growth in the short, medium, and I believe in the longer term. So the fact that we have the Remain campaign, which says, okay, we're going to be better off, safer, more secure if we're part of the European Union, from a whole host of different people, different experts, whatever you like. And the Leave campaign, for me, its leaders seem to be less certain about the kind of relationship that they want with the European Union. Boris Johnson advocates a Canadian-style agreement. Michael Gove, underlining his desire to have no single market agreement, which is tougher than Margaret Thatcher was, of wanting to be like Albania, although the Albania Prime Minister says, you can have my relationship, I really don't want it, I want to be in the European Union, then you have a question mark. Is what actually does the Leave campaign want? Is it a Norwegian style, or was it? It's going to be somewhat difficult if we don't quite know what they wish actually would like. But there is, and I conclude here, a very clear link between having access to markets and the ability of us to be able to share some sovereignty or contribute to funds in the budget to be able to make sure that we can have a decent relationship. And I would personally say that it's actually better that we should stay where we are, where we can have a veto on things which we don't actually really like having Turkey in the European Union, we have a veto. That's not going to happen in my lifetime. I don't believe it. And so what you have then is this question of risk. Dan, you argue, as I've heard it, it's a greater risk to stay in the European Union than to be outside the European Union. Well, I would simply say that there are risks of going out from the European Union which I think outweigh the risks of staying in. Not only is it the question of our economic well-being, but if we are to withdraw and say we're not going to be sharing sovereignty with you guys anymore, that'll trigger a reaction across many states in the European Union, like Hungary, Poland, and others who say, oh, we want the British deal as well. So the pressures will be very strong in the European Union. My parliamentary colleagues, who I do still meet from time to time, my former colleagues, say the deals will be tough because the EU will want to survive. And then if you look 2 years down the road, can you really believe that Scotland voting to remain in the European Union will not want to trigger off a referendum at some point in time? It's unbelievable that you can argue that they're never going to do that, because guess what? Financially it doesn't matter, because the European Investment Bank will pay whatever's necessary to make sure that Scotland becomes a viable entity. And lastly, one shock horror story, which I hope will never happen, and I think Dan shares me with this. Imagine President Trump being elected as US president. Everybody said he didn't have a chance 12 months ago to be Republican candidate. I go to the States often, and there's a real sense of real determination amongst voters, as there is in this country and elsewhere after the Great Recession, whatever, to give people in office a real kick, and Hillary Clinton is one who I suspect many people would want to kick. But President Trump has made it clear he does favor Brexit, but he also doesn't think NATO has any place in the future world. So if we listen to Boris Johnson and say, oh, it's not the EU, it's NATO who's going to provide our security, I just say good luck, because I don't think you can necessarily count on that.